perhaps the most anomalous narrative sequence in all of his text. When Mormon introduces his historical Gadiantons, he's telling a fairly simple tale, but he elects to tell it in a most unusual and convoluted way. Mormon's history of the Gadiantons begins in the 42nd year of the reign of the judges, or about 50 BC. After the initial introduction of the Gadianton robbers in the body of Helaman 2, Mormon adds these comments to the end of the chapter. And this is Helaman 2, verses 13 to 14. And now behold, in the end of this book, ye shall see that this Gadianton did prove the overthrow, yea, almost the entire destruction of the people of Nephi. Behold, I do not mean the end of the book of Helaman, I mean the end of the book of Nephi, from which I have taken all the count which I have written. Notice that Mormon has been speaking of an historical event, and at this point makes a shift in narrative time to Mormon's present. It's at this point that we have what must be the most confusing narrative interruption in the Book of Mormon. After this look forward in time, Mormon abruptly changes the subject. He has been talking about Gadianton robbers. He's even created a foreshadowing link between those Gadiantons and his own time. Now he stops, makes a full chapter break, and begins the next chapter with what appears to be a completely unrelated topic. Mormon inserts a discussion of migrations to the lands northward. Even more surprisingly, Mormon brackets this migration on both ends with a shift in narrative time to his own day. After this recent shift in narrative time, even Mormon understands that he has interrupted his narrative, for at the end of this sequence he states, "And now I return again to my account." The account to which he returns is the Gadiantons, the subject that he left. As if understanding the now you see them, now you don't Gadiantons were not sufficiently difficult, Mormon introduces these enigmatic figures with a narrative sequence that's equally enigmatic. However, none of this is in error. Each of these anomalies is intentionally placed by Mormon the author for his own narrative purposes. This sequence, awkward though it might appear, was carefully constructed to elaborate the meta-message of the secret combinations. In this anomalous text, we have Mormon's intentional identification of the historical Gadiantons as he sees them. Mormon's clue to the historical events is this very text of northward migration that is framed by references to the future. Both before he begins this narrative sequence and immediately afterward, Mormon references his own time. This shift in narrative time is important because it tells us that the narrative in between is the focal point on which the time shift is made. Mormon is doing more than denoting place. He is connecting time. The inserted, out-of-place narrative describes a northward migration of Nephites. Of course, Mormon has discussed northern migrations before, but this description is unique. For example, the northward migration of Hagoth received some notice, but the narrative emphasis was on the departure, not the ultimate destination. In contrast, this inserted section emphasizes the land to which the people are presumed to travel. This textually unusual fixation on the land of destination is even more curious because there is no indication that any of these people came back to tell about the land northward. As historians, we must ask the serious question of how Mormon arrived at his description of the land northward, since he does not record any of these people coming back to describe where it was or its characteristics. Nevertheless, Mormon describes it in some detail. Helaman chapter 3, verses 4 to 7. And they did travel to an exceedingly great distance, insomuch that they came to large bodies of water and many rivers. Yea, and even they did spread forth into all parts of the land, into whatever parts had not been rendered desolate and without timber, because of the many inhabitants who had inherited the land. And now no part of the land was desolate, save it were for timber, but because of the greatness of the destruction of the people who had before inhabited the land, it was called desolate. And there being but little timber upon the face of the land, the people who went forth became exceedingly expert in the working of cement. Therefore, they did build houses of cement, in which they did dwell. The detail of the description of the land northward is given in such a way that Mormon likely supposed that we should easily understand what he's describing. The passage of time has made his description a little less obvious than it would have been to Mormon, but still he gives us enough information to make the identification of the location to which he's referring. The essential elements that allow us to identify this area are: it's northward of the Nephite lands, there are many waters, it is nearly desolate of trees, and there are cement buildings. I'm not thirsty. From perhaps 100 BC to 600 AD, there is only one area in Mesoamerica that fits all of these descriptions, and that's the city known as Teotihuacan. It is north of the Nephite lands. It's near the lake that at that time occupied the current site of Mexico City. It has buildings made of high-quality cement. The lack of trees and the environmental imbalance created by denuding the land of trees is hypothesized as a major factor in creating the downfall of Teotihuacan. We have several very specific requirements that must all converge at one point to fit Mormon's description, and there is only one area in Mesoamerica, if not in all the world, that fits this description well in that time period. Mormon, the author, is pointing his finger at a specific location at a specific time because that location serves as the historical fulcrum on which his meta-narrative is leveraged. In spite of the accuracy of this description of Teotihuacan, there's nevertheless a major problem with the fit. The problem is one of timing. The particular conditions that require the area to be devoid of trees and dominated by buildings of cement do not belong to the Teotihuacan of 49 BC when the northward migration is described by Mormon, but rather the Teotihuacan of 250 AD and later. It's at this point that we understand the nature of the references to the future that frame the northward migration narrative. Mormon does not have historical records that tell of the land to which these people went, but Mormon nevertheless gives us a particular location for them, a location they may or may not have reached. His understanding of that land is based on his own current time period, but we have this Mormon describing the Teotihuacan that he knows in his own time and pushing that description earlier into history. This is not unknown for ancient historians, but for some modern ones. However, it also doesn't matter. It really is the Teotihuacan of his own time that is his concern. Mormon intentionally links this migration northward to the land of Teotihuacan, not because of historical accuracy, but precisely because he desires to tie the Gadiantons of Helaman's time to the Gadiantons of his own time. Remember that both before and after the narrative insertion of the migration of the land northward, Mormon has shifted the narrative focus to his own time period. Whether consciously or unconsciously, Mormon is notifying us that the concern for the land northward pertains to his own day, and that it has a link to a previous time. For Mormon, this migration northward is the bridge over which Helaman's Gadiantons will walk through time and space to become Mormon's Gadiantons. It is those newer Gadiantons who are causing the destruction of Mormon's people that he uses as historical backbone that will link all of the secret combinations together, a set of destructive combinations that are culminating in the final demise of the Nephites. It's important that we recognize that this tie between the first Gadiantons and the last Gadiantons that Mormon makes through this bridge in time and space is an artificial construction. It's at this point that we see the author describing the patterns rather than the iron filings. There is very little chance that the iron filings are the same, even though Mormon makes a pattern out of them. A brief note on the narrative history of the Gadianton should suffice to show the artificiality of the tie between these two Gadianton bands. After the first Gadianton secret combination accomplishes its fatalistic task of destroying the Nephite government just before the arrival of the Savior, they disappear from the land for over 260 years. When they reappear, they grow in power and in importance until they can be said to have spread all over the face of the land. When Mormon reintroduces the secret combination, he does so by calling them Gadianton robbers. This is a different group in a different land with a gap of 260 years between them and their earlier namesakes. Seen with the dispassionate eye of modern historiography, it is highly unlikely that this latter group that appears to be prominent throughout most of the land would have remembered and honored an otherwise short-lived and obscure band of robbers from inside the Nephite polity. Is there any history behind this historical artifice? If there is, we will find it by looking where Mormon tells us to look. We must look at the land northward that has many waters, is devoid of trees, is made of cement, and is on his mind in his own day. We must look at how Teotihuacan might explain the Gadianton robbers, because Mormon is telling us that they do. It is in Teotihuacan that we must look if we can find the iron filing events that underlay Mormon's patterned history. Finding a lot of documentation of a secret society in ancient history is almost a fool's errand, since their very nature is to be secret. In Mesoamerica, this problem is exacerbated by the nature of the available sources. Very few pre-conquest texts are available, and the vast majority of our information comes from post-conquest sources. This means that we must do what has been termed upstreaming. That is, we begin